The desert wind carried dust across the San Carlos Apache Reservation as Tommy Crowfeather limped slowly down the gravel road. His right leg dragged slightly with each step, a reminder of that terrible night 20 years ago. The scars on the left side of his face caught the afternoon sunlight, white lines that told a story he wished he could forget. At 28, Tommy had seen more pain than most people twice his age. 2 tours in Afghanistan had added invisible wounds to the visible ones he already carried. Now back home in Arizona, he worked whatever jobs he could find, fixing fences, hauling water, cleaning the community center after events he was never invited to attend. The reservation felt different since he'd returned 6 months ago. Or maybe he was the one who had changed. People still stared when they thought he wasn't looking. He caught their whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when he walked by. The same words that had followed him since childhood echoed in their voices. "That's Tommy Crowfeather. You know, the one who—" They never finished the sentence out loud anymore, but they didn't need to. Everyone knew the story. Everyone remembered the night when 8-year-old Tommy couldn't save his little sister from the flames that took their families home. Everyone remembered how his parents had looked at him afterward, not with anger, but with something worse. Disappointment. The kind that said maybe the wrong child had made it out alive. Tommy pulled his baseball cap lower over his eyes as he passed the tribal council building. Through the windows, he could see the monthly meeting in progress. Important decisions were being made about the future of their community, but nobody had asked for his input in years. Why would they? What could someone like him possibly contribute? His grandmother's small house sat at the end of a dirt path, surrounded by a garden she tended with the same careful attention she'd once given to raising him, after his parents couldn't bear to look at their surviving son. Rosa Crowfeather was 73 now, her hair silver white and her hands weathered from decades of traditional beadwork that tourists bought at the cultural center. "Tommy," she called from her porch, where she sat working on a pair of moccasins. "Come sit with me." He wanted to keep walking, to disappear into his trailer behind her house and close the door on another day of being invisible. But Rosa's voice carried the same gentle authority it had when he was a scared, burned child who woke up screaming every night. "Grandmother, I'm tired," he said, but his feet had already turned toward her porch steps. "Tired from work or tired from carrying that heavy load in your heart?" Rosa's dark eyes studied his face with the same intensity she used to examine her beadwork. "Sit. The sunset is beautiful tonight." Tommy eased himself onto the wooden step beside her chair, his bad leg grateful for the rest. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky turn orange and pink behind the distant mountains. This was one of the few places where he felt almost normal, where the weight of 20 years of shame seemed a little lighter. "Mrs. Wilson from the tribal office came by today," Rosa said, her fingers never stopping their careful work on the moccasins. "They have a job offer for you." Tommy's stomach tightened. "What kind of job?" "A researcher is coming to study our healing traditions. She needs someone who knows the land, someone who understands the sacred places." Rosa glanced at him. "They thought of you." "They thought of me because nobody else wants to deal with an outsider," Tommy said bitterly. "Stick the broken Apache with the curious white person and let them figure it out together." Rosa set down her beadwork and turned to face him fully. "Or maybe they thought of you because you know these mountains and desert better than anyone. Maybe because your grandfather taught you the old stories and I taught you the healing ways, and you remember what others have forgotten." Tommy shook his head. "Grandmother, you know what people think of me. I'm not the right person to represent our traditions to some college professor who wants to write a book about us. What I know," Rosa said firmly, "is that you spent your childhood learning from the elders because you had nowhere else to go. What I know is that you can track a rabbit through solid rock and find water where others see only dirt. What I know is that you understand the sacred sites because you've sat with them in solitude while others were busy with their daily lives." The old woman reached over and touched the scarred side of his face gently. "These marks don't make you less worthy, grandson. They make you someone who understands pain and healing. Maybe that's exactly what this researcher needs to learn about." Tommy closed his eyes at his grandmother's touch. For a moment he could almost believe her words, almost imagine that his knowledge meant something, that his years of solitude had been preparation rather than punishment. "When does she arrive?" he asked quietly. "Next week. Her name is Dr. Liu, and she's coming from back east. She asked specifically for someone who could guide her to the traditional healing places, someone who knows the proper protocols. Rosa picked up her beadwork again. Mrs. Wilson said she seemed different from the others. Respectful. Tommy had heard that before. Researchers came through every few years, full of good intentions and academic theories. They took their notes, snapped their photos, and wrote their papers. Then they left, and the reservation went back to being forgotten by the outside world until the next curious academic showed up. But the money would be good, and he needed the work. His savings from the military were running low, and pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. Besides, what was the worst that could happen? Another outsider would see him as damaged goods and pity him? He was used to that. "Tell Mrs. Wilson I'll do it," he said, standing up slowly. "But I'm not promising to be friendly about it." Rosa smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from anyone all day. "Just be yourself, Tommy, that's enough." As he walked to his trailer, Tommy wondered if his grandmother was right. Maybe being himself would be enough for this Dr. Liu. But as he looked at his reflection in his window, the scars, the tired eyes, the shoulders that carried invisible weight, he doubted it. In his experience, being himself had never been enough for anyone. Still, a job was a job. And if some researcher wanted to spend her time with the reservation's outcast, that was her choice to make. He just hoped she knew what she was getting into. Dr. Amy Liu stepped out of her rental car and immediately felt like she was in a different world. The San Carlos Apache Reservation stretched out before her under the vast Arizona sky, mountains rising in the distance like ancient guardians. The air was dry and clean, so different from the humid streets of Boston where she'd spent the last 4 years working on her doctorate. At 26, Amy had already traveled to remote corners of the world studying traditional healing practices, but this felt different, more personal somehow. Maybe it was because her own grandmother had been a traditional Chinese medicine practitioner, teaching Amy about herbs and energy flow before she was old enough to understand that not every family kept dried roots hanging in their kitchen. Amy grabbed her equipment bags from the car and looked around the small administrative building where she was supposed to meet with the tribal council. She'd spent months preparing for this research trip, learning about Apache history and protocols, making sure she approached this community with the respect they deserved. Too many researchers had come before her with attitudes of superiority, treating indigenous knowledge like curiosities rather than sophisticated medical traditions. Dr. Liu, a woman in her 50s, emerged from the building, extending her hand with a warm smile. "I'm Janet Wilson from the tribal office. Welcome to San Carlos." "Thank you so much for having me," Amy replied, shaking Janet's hand. "I know my research proposal was pretty detailed, but I want to make sure I'm following all the proper protocols." Janet nodded approvingly. "We appreciate that. Too many outsiders show up thinking they can just point cameras wherever they want and ask any questions that pop into their heads. Your application showed real respect for our ways." They walked into the building together, past walls decorated with traditional artwork and photos of tribal leaders. Amy noticed how different this felt from the sterile university offices she was used to. Everything here had meaning, history, connection to something deeper than academic achievement. "The council reviewed your proposal last week," Janet continued as they entered a conference room. "Your focus on traditional healing practices and how they complement modern medicine, that's something our community cares about. A lot of our young people are losing touch with the old ways." Amy set down her bags and pulled out a folder. "That's exactly why this research matters. Traditional healing systems aren't just historical curiosities. They're sophisticated approaches to wellness that modern medicine is finally starting to understand and respect." "The elders will be glad to hear you say that," Janet smiled. "Now about your request for a cultural guide. We've found someone who knows the sacred sites and understands the protocols. His name is Tommy Crowfeather." Amy pulled out her notebook. "Can you tell me about his background? I want to make sure I approach our working relationship appropriately." Janet paused, choosing her words carefully. "Tommy is complex. He grew up here, knows the land better than anyone. His grandmother Rosa is one of our most respected traditional healers. Tommy learned a lot from her and from other elders when he was young." "That sounds perfect for what I need," Amy said, sensing there was more to the story. "He's been through some difficult times," Janet continued. "Lost his sister in a house fire when they were children, served in Afghanistan, came back changed like a lot of our veterans do. He keeps to himself mostly, but his knowledge of traditional ways is deep. Amy nodded thoughtfully. Trauma can actually make someone more connected to healing traditions. Some of the most powerful healers I've worked with around the world have been people who've experienced significant loss. Tommy might not see it that way. Janet warned gently. He doesn't think very highly of himself these days. But the council felt you two might work well together. You're both outsiders in your own ways. When do I meet him? Tomorrow morning. He'll pick you up at your hotel and take you to see Rosa first. She'll want to meet you before she shares any traditional knowledge. That's how we do things here. The elders decide who's worthy of learning our ways. That evening, Amy sat in her hotel room reviewing her research notes and feeling nervous in a way she hadn't experienced in years. She'd interviewed traditional healers in remote villages in South America, studied with medicine women in rural Africa, worked alongside shamans in the Arctic. But something about this assignment felt more significant. Maybe it was because she'd grown up feeling caught between two worlds. Her grandmother's traditional Chinese medicine and her parents' embrace of Western culture. She understood what it felt like to have ancient knowledge dismissed as superstition, to watch traditional ways slowly disappear as younger generations chose modern paths. The next morning, Amy waited outside her hotel with her research equipment, wondering what Tommy Crowfeather would be like. She expected someone older, maybe wearing traditional clothing, possibly suspicious of her motives like some of the other indigenous researchers she'd worked with initially. Instead, a battered pickup truck pulled up and out stepped a man about her age wearing jeans, work boots, and a baseball cap. He was tall and lean, with shoulder-length black hair and a face that would have been handsome if not for the visible scars on one side, and eyes that seemed to carry too much weight for someone so young. "Dr. Liu?" His voice was quiet, almost reluctant. "I'm Tommy." "Please call me Amy," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for agreeing to work with me." He shook her hand briefly, his grip strong but his eye contact minimal. "My grandmother wants to meet you before we go anywhere. She needs to decide if you're worth teaching." Amy loaded her equipment into the truck, noticing how Tommy moved with a slight limp and kept his scarred side turned away from her. "I'd be honored to meet her. I understand she's a respected healer in your community." Tommy glanced at her in surprise, as if he hadn't expected her to know that. "She is. Learned from her grandmother, who learned from hers. Real traditional knowledge, not the watered-down stuff they sell to tourists." As they drove through the reservation, Amy looked out at the landscape. Red rocks, sparse vegetation, houses scattered across the desert. It was beautiful in its starkness, but she could also see the poverty, the struggle that many reservations faced. "Have you worked with researchers before?" she asked, trying to break the tension she sensed in Tommy. "No," he said simply. "Janet thought it might be good for me to try something new." Amy sensed there was a lot more to that story, but she didn't push. Instead, she looked out at the mountains and said, "This is beautiful country. I can see why it would be sacred to your people." For the first time, Tommy looked directly at her. "You really think that? Or are you just saying what you think I want to hear?" His directness surprised her, but she appreciated it. "I really think that. I grew up in cities, but my grandmother always taught me that the land holds memory and power. Looking at these mountains, I can feel that truth." Tommy was quiet for a long moment. Then, almost reluctantly, he said, "Wait until you see the sunrise from Eagle's Peak. That's when you'll understand what sacred really means." Amy smiled, feeling like she'd just passed some kind of test. Maybe this partnership would work out after all. Rosa Crowfeather's house sat at the end of a dusty road, surrounded by a garden that seemed to grow despite the desert climate. Amy could see herbs and plants she didn't recognize, their leaves catching the morning sunlight like small green prayers. Tommy knocked on the door and called out in Apache. An elderly woman appeared, her silver hair braided with colorful ribbons, her dark eyes sharp and assessing as they studied Amy from head to toe. "Grandmother." "This is Dr. Amy Liu," Tommy said in English, his voice softer and more respectful than Amy had heard it before. "Come inside," Rosa said simply. "Both of you." The house was small but felt spacious, with traditional artwork on the walls and the scent of sage and sweetgrass in the air. Rosa gestured for Amy to sit on a worn couch while she settled into a rocking chair across from her. Tommy remained standing near the door as if ready to escape. "Tommy says you want to learn about our healing ways," Rosa began, her English accented but clear. "Tell me why." Amy had prepared for this question. But sitting in front of this dignified elder, her rehearsed academic answers felt hollow. Instead, she found herself speaking from her heart. "My grandmother was a traditional healer in China," Amy said. "She taught me that medicine isn't just about fixing symptoms. It's about understanding the whole person, their spirit as well as their body. When she died, I felt like I lost that connection to something deeper. I study traditional healing now because I want to understand how different cultures approach wellness, how they've kept that holistic knowledge alive." Rosa listened without interrupting, her eyes never leaving Amy's face. When Amy finished, the older woman was quiet for a long moment. "Your grandmother, she gave you a gift," Rosa finally said. "But gifts must be used wisely, with respect. Our healing knowledge is not just information to be written down in books. It's sacred, connected to our relationship with the Creator and the land." "I understand," Amy said earnestly. "I'm not here to take your knowledge and claim it as my own. I want to document how traditional practices can work alongside modern medicine, how they can help people heal in ways that hospitals sometimes can't." Rosa looked at Tommy, who had been unusually quiet. "What do you think, grandson?" Tommy shifted uncomfortably. "It's not my place to decide, grandmother. I'm just supposed to show her around." "Everything is your place if you choose to make it so," Rosa said firmly. Then she turned back to Amy. "You want to learn about healing? Then you must understand that the healer and the one being healed are connected. My grandson here, he knows more about traditional ways than most people half his age, but he doesn't believe his knowledge has value." Amy glanced at Tommy, who was staring at his feet. "Maybe we could start with the plants in your garden? I'd love to learn about traditional medicine preparations." For the next hour, Rosa walked Amy through her garden, explaining the properties of different plants and how they were used in healing ceremonies. Tommy followed silently, occasionally adding details that showed his deep knowledge of traditional practices. "The desert willow," Rosa said, touching a tall plant with purple flowers. "Good for heart problems, but also for emotional healing. Sometimes the heart that hurts isn't the one that pumps blood." Amy took careful notes, asking thoughtful questions that showed she understood the spiritual aspects of what Rosa was sharing. As they talked, she noticed Tommy relaxing slightly, even offering explanations when his grandmother paused. "Tommy learned all this as a child," Rosa said proudly. "His parents were too busy with their own pain to teach him, so the elders did. He has good hands for healing work." Tommy's face darkened. "Grandmother, don't what?" "Don't tell the truth?" Rosa's voice carried gentle authority. "Dr. Liu, my grandson, thinks his scars make him unfit to help others heal. What do you think?" Amy looked at Tommy carefully, seeing the tension in his shoulders, the way he turned his scarred side away from her. "I think scars often mean someone has survived something difficult and learned from it. In my experience, the best healers are people who understand pain from the inside." Tommy looked up at her sharply, as if trying to determine whether she was being sincere or just polite. "Let's go to the sacred spring," Rosa said suddenly. "Amy needs to see how the land itself can heal." They drove in Tommy's truck to a remote canyon where water trickled from red rocks into a small pool surrounded by ancient petroglyphs. The place felt powerful, charged with centuries of prayer and ceremony. "This water has been used for healing for over 1,000 years, Tommy said quietly, speaking directly to Amy for the first time all morning. "People come here when modern medicine isn't enough." Amy knelt by the pool, feeling the cool air rising from the water. "It feels sacred," she said simply. "Everything here is sacred if you know how to see it," Tommy replied. "The rocks, the water, the plants, even the animals, they're all part of the healing." As if summoned by his words, a red-tailed hawk circled overhead, crying out as it rode the thermal currents. Amy watched it soar, marveling at the grace and power of its flight. Suddenly, the hawk faltered, one wing dropping awkwardly. It spiraled down, crashing into the rocks near the pool. Without hesitation, Tommy moved toward the injured bird, his limp forgotten in the urgency of the moment. "Don't come closer," he warned Amy. "Hawks can be dangerous when they're hurt." Amy watched in amazement as Tommy approached the bird slowly, speaking to it in a low, soothing voice, and some words in Apache, others in English. The hawk's eyes were wild with fear and pain, but it didn't try to attack as Tommy carefully examined its wing. "Broken," he said, then looked around the area. "Amy, can you find some straight twigs about this long?" He held up his fingers to show her the size he needed. As Amy searched for suitable twigs, Tommy continued talking to the hawk, his voice calm and reassuring. When she returned with the materials, she watched him carefully splint the bird's wing using techniques that seemed to blend veterinary knowledge with something more intuitive. "Where did you learn to do that?" Amy asked as Tommy gently wrapped the splint with strips torn from his shirt. "My grandmother taught me that all living things have the same energy, the same spirit," Tommy said, his hands gentle but confident as he worked. "If you can feel that connection, you can help heal." The hawk grew calmer under Tommy's touch, as if sensing his intention to help, rather than harm. When the splint was secure, Tommy made a small shelter for the bird in the shade of the rocks and left water within reach. "We'll check on him tomorrow," he said, washing his hands in the sacred spring. Sometimes healing takes time. Amy stared at Tommy with new respect. In the past hour, she'd seen him transform from a reluctant, self-conscious guide into someone who moved with quiet confidence and deep knowledge. The way he'd handled the injured hawk showed skills that went far beyond what any textbook could teach. "That was incredible," she said. "You have a real gift for healing." Tommy's walls went up again immediately. "It's just something my grandmother taught me. Nothing special." "Tommy," Amy said firmly, "what I just watched was definitely special. You connected with that bird in a way that calmed it and allowed you to help. That's not just technique. That's real healing ability." For a moment, Tommy looked like he might believe her. Then he shook his head and started walking back toward the truck. "We should get back. My grandmother will be wondering where we are." As they drove home, Amy found herself thinking about the contrast between Tommy's obvious abilities and his complete lack of confidence in himself. She'd worked with traditional healers around the world, and what she'd just witnessed was genuine skill combined with deep spiritual connection. Yet Tommy seemed to see himself as damaged goods, unworthy of respect or recognition. "Can I ask you something?" Amy said as they neared Rose's house. Tommy tensed. "Depends what it is. Would you be willing to teach me some of what you know? Not just about plants and sacred sites, but about that kind of healing connection you made with the hawk?" Tommy was quiet for so long that Amy thought he wasn't going to answer. Finally, he said, "Why would you want to learn from someone like me?" "Because," Amy said honestly, "in all my travels and research, I've rarely seen someone with such natural healing ability. Your grandmother is right. You do have good hands for this work." Tommy pulled into Rose's driveway and sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel. "People don't usually see me that way," he said quietly. "Then maybe it's time you started seeing yourself differently," Amy replied, "because what I saw today was pretty amazing." As they walked back to Rose's house, Amy noticed Tommy walking a little straighter, his shoulders not quite as tense. It was a small change, but it felt like the beginning of something important. Over the next 2 weeks, Amy and Tommy fell into a routine that surprised them both. Each morning, he would pick her up at her hotel, and they would spend the day visiting sacred sites, meeting with elders, and documenting traditional healing practices. What had started as a reluctant professional arrangement was slowly becoming something that felt like friendship. Amy discovered that Tommy knew stories about every rock formation, every hidden spring, every ancient trail that crossed the reservation. More importantly, he understood the spiritual significance of these places in ways that went beyond academic knowledge. When he spoke about the land, his usual guardedness fell away, replaced by a passion that made his whole face light up. "My grandfather brought me here when I was 6, Tommy said, as they hiked to a mesa overlooking the valley. "He said the spirits of our ancestors still walk these paths, and if I listened carefully, I could hear their wisdom." Amy struggled to keep up with his pace despite his limp. Tommy moved through the desert like he belonged there, finding handholds and footholds that she would have missed completely. "Do you still hear them?" she asked. Tommy paused at the top of a rocky outcrop, looking out over the vast landscape. "Sometimes. Usually when I'm alone up here thinking about things." They sat in comfortable silence, sharing water and energy bars while the wind whispered through the rocks around them. Amy had learned not to push Tommy when he seemed to retreat into himself. Instead, she waited, letting the peace of the place work its own magic. "Can I ask you about your family?" Amy said finally. "Rosa mentioned that you lost your sister." Tommy's body went rigid. "That's not something I talk about." "I lost someone too," Amy said quietly. "My little brother. He had leukemia, fought it for 3 years before he died. I was supposed to be the big sister who protected him, but I couldn't save him from cancer. Tommy looked at her with surprise. How old were you? 15 when he died. Old enough to understand that there are some things you can't fix no matter how much you love someone or how hard you try. Amy picked up a small stone and turned it over in her hands. For a long time, I felt like I'd failed him somehow. Tommy was quiet for several minutes, staring out at the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I was 8. Katie was 6. There was a fire in our apartment building. Amy waited, not moving, hardly breathing, afraid that any sound might stop him from continuing. I woke up and the hallway was full of smoke. I could hear Katie crying in her room, but the hallway was too hot. I tried to get to her, but the ceiling started falling down. Tommy's hand unconsciously went to the scars on his face. Someone pulled me out. Fireman, I think. But Katie... Tommy, Amy said softly. You were 8 years old. Old enough to save my sister. His voice was bitter, filled with 20 years of self-blame. Everyone said I was brave for trying, but brave doesn't matter if you fail. Amy turned to face him fully. What about the other children in the building? The ones in the apartment next to yours? Tommy looked confused. What do you mean? Rosa told me about that night. She said you didn't just try to save Katie. You ran through that burning hallway screaming for everyone to wake up, pounding on doors, making sure other families got out. Amy's voice was gentle, but firm. 3 families escaped because an 8-year-old boy risked his life to warn them. That's not... I don't remember. Tommy shook his head. Trauma does that sometimes. We remember our failures but forget our successes, especially when we're children dealing with more than any child should have to handle. Amy reached out carefully and touched his arm. You saved lives that night, Tommy. Just because you couldn't save everyone doesn't mean you failed. Tommy pulled away from her touch, but not angrily. My parents never saw it that way. After Katie died, they could barely look at me, like I was a reminder of what they'd lost instead of what they still had. That says more about their grief than about your worth, Amy said. Sometimes parents deal with loss in ways that hurt the children who survive. It doesn't mean they were right. They sat in silence again while Tommy absorbed her words. Amy could see him struggling with ideas that challenged 20 years of believing he was fundamentally flawed, fundamentally unworthy. In Chinese medicine, Amy said eventually, we believe that emotional wounds create blockages in the body's energy flow. Physical healing can't happen completely until those emotional blockages are cleared. Are you trying to heal me, Dr. Liu? Tommy asked, and for the first time since she'd known him, there was a hint of humor in his voice. Maybe we're healing each other, Amy replied. You're teaching me things about traditional medicine that I could never learn from books. And maybe I can help you see yourself the way others see you. How do you see me? The question came out before Tommy could stop it, vulnerable and raw. Amy considered her words carefully. I see someone who carries deep knowledge about healing and connection to the land. I see someone who moves through the world with gentleness, even when the world hasn't been gentle to him. I see someone who risks his own safety to help an injured hawk, who knows stories that keep ancient wisdom alive. Tommy stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. You don't see the scars, the limp? The guy who lives in a trailer behind his grandmother's house because he can't figure out how to build a real life? I see all of that too, Amy said honestly. But those things don't define you. They're just part of your story, not the whole story. As they hiked back down the mesa, Amy noticed Tommy seemed lighter somehow, as if putting his grief into words had lifted some invisible weight. When they reached the truck, he turned to her with an expression she hadn't seen before, almost hopeful. Tomorrow I want to show you the healing caves, he said. But first we need to prepare properly. Traditional ceremony, offerings to the spirits. If you're going to document our ways, you need to understand that it's not just about the techniques. It's about relationship, with the land, with the ancestors, with something bigger than ourselves. Amy nodded, feeling honored by his trust. I'd like that very much. As Tommy drove her back to the hotel, Amy found herself thinking about the shift that had happened between them. What had started as professional courtesy was becoming genuine friendship, and something else she was afraid to name. She was drawn to Tommy's quiet strength, his deep connection to his traditions, the way he cared for wounded things without expecting anything in return. But she was also aware of the barriers between them, not just the obvious ones of race and culture, but the deeper ones of his self-doubt and her temporary status on the reservation. In a few months, her research would be finished, and she would return to her academic life in Boston. Tommy would still be here, still carrying the wounds that made him believe he wasn't worthy of love. The thought of leaving him behind was starting to hurt more than she wanted to admit. But Amy had learned long ago that caring about someone didn't always mean you could save them. Sometimes the best you could do was show them a different way to see themselves and hope it was enough to start their own healing journey. As Tommy pulled up to her hotel, he looked at her with an expression that seemed to hold the same mixture of hope and uncertainty she was feeling. "Thank you," he said simply, "for listening, for not running away when I told you about Katie." "Thank you for trusting me with your story," Amy replied. "I know that wasn't easy." As she watched him drive away, Amy realized that somewhere along the way, this research project had become about more than documenting traditional healing practices. It had become about understanding that healing, real healing, required courage from both the healer and the one being healed. And sometimes it required admitting that you couldn't do it alone. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning when Tommy and Amy were having coffee at the Tribal Council building, waiting for permission to visit a particularly sacred site. Amy noticed the disapproving looks first, the way conversations stopped when they walked by, the way people turned away when Tommy tried to make eye contact. "Is everything okay?" Amy asked as they sat at a picnic table outside, reviewing her notes from the previous day. Tommy followed her gaze to where a group of tribal members stood near the parking lot, their voices low but their gestures animated. He recognized most of them, people he'd grown up with, gone to school with, people who'd never quite forgiven him for surviving when his sister didn't. "Some people don't think I should be the one showing you around," Tommy said quietly, his old defensiveness creeping back into his voice. Before Amy could respond, Janet Wilson approached their table with an uncomfortable expression. "Tommy, could I speak with you for a minute?" Privately, Amy watched as Tommy followed Janet inside, his shoulders already tense with anticipation of bad news. Through the window, she could see Janet talking earnestly, while Tommy stood with his arms crossed, his face growing darker by the minute. When he came back outside, Amy could see the walls going up again, the careful distance he'd maintained for the first week returning like armor. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing," Tommy said, but his voice was flat, emotionless. "We should go check on that hawk we found yesterday." During the drive to the sacred spring, Tommy was unusually quiet. Amy tried several times to start conversations, but he answered in short, clipped sentences that discouraged further discussion. It was like watching him disappear back into the shell she'd thought he was finally emerging from. The hawk was doing well, its wing healing cleanly in the splint Tommy had fashioned. As Tommy checked the bird's progress, Amy noticed his movements were careful but distant, lacking the gentle confidence she'd seen before. "Tommy, please tell me what Janet said to you," Amy pressed when they were driving back. He was quiet for so long that Amy thought he wasn't going to answer. Finally, he pulled over to the side of the road and turned off the engine. "Some people think you and I are getting too close," he said, staring out the windshield. "They think you're taking advantage of me or that I'm sharing sacred knowledge I shouldn't be sharing with an outsider." Amy felt her heart sink. "And what do you think?" "I think maybe they're right." Tommy's voice was barely audible. "I think maybe I forgot my place." "What's that supposed to mean?" Tommy finally looked at her, and Amy was shocked by the pain in his eyes. "Amy, look at me. Really look at me. I'm a scarred, broken-down Apache who lives in a trailer and can't even hold down a steady job. You're a doctor with degrees from fancy universities, going places I can't even imagine. What did I think was going to happen here?" "I thought we were becoming friends," Amy said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I thought we were learning from each other." "Friends," Tommy repeated bitterly. "Right. That's what this is." Amy stared at him, suddenly understanding that there were layers to this conversation she hadn't recognized. "Tommy, is this about what people are saying, or is this about something else?" "Does it matter?" He started the truck again. "Either way, I think we should keep things more professional from now on. I'll show you what you need to see, answer your questions about traditional practices, but that's it." The rest of the day passed in uncomfortable silence. Tommy fulfilled his obligations as her guide, but the easy camaraderie they'd developed was gone. He answered her questions about plant identification and ceremonial protocols with the same mechanical precision he might use to recite a textbook. That evening, Amy sat in her hotel room feeling frustrated and confused. She called her research advisor at the university, hoping for guidance. But Dr. Martinez's advice only made things worse. Amy, you need to be careful about getting too emotionally invested in your research subjects, he warned. Maintaining professional boundaries is crucial, especially when you're working with vulnerable populations. Vulnerable populations? Amy felt her temper flare. These are real people with sophisticated knowledge systems, not research subjects to be studied from a distance. I understand your passion for the work, but remember that you're there as a researcher, not a social worker. Your job is to document their practices, not to fix their personal problems. After hanging up, Amy stared at her reflection in the hotel mirror. Was that what she'd been doing? Trying to fix Tommy instead of simply learning from him? Had she crossed some line without realizing it? The next few days were torture. Tommy arrived each morning exactly on time, polite and professional. But the warmth and trust they'd built seemed to have evaporated overnight. He still shared his knowledge of traditional healing practices, but it felt like he was reading from a script rather than speaking from his heart. Amy tried several times to bridge the gap between them, but Tommy deflected every attempt at personal conversation. When she asked about his time in Afghanistan, he gave her basic facts without context. When she mentioned the hawk they'd rescued, he simply said it was healing well and changed the subject. The breaking point came when they were visiting Rosa's garden and the elderly woman asked Amy how her research was progressing. It's going well, Amy said carefully. Tommy has been very knowledgeable about traditional practices. Rosa looked between Amy and her grandson with sharp eyes. Knowledgeable but not connected, I think. What happened to the friendship I was seeing between you two? We're keeping things professional, grandmother, Tommy said stiffly. Professional, Rosa repeated, the word dripping with disdain. And who decided that friendship and learning couldn't exist together? Some people in the community have concerns, Tommy replied, not meeting his grandmother's eyes. Some people always have concerns about things they don't understand, Rosa shot back. The question is whether you're going to let their fears make your decisions for you. That afternoon, as Amy and Tommy drove back from a ceremonial site in uncomfortable silence, Amy finally reached her breaking point. Stop the truck, she said. What? Pull over. I want to talk to you. And I'm not going to do it while you're hiding behind the steering wheel. Tommy reluctantly pulled off the main road into a dusty turnout. Amy got out of the truck and walked a few yards away, her frustration and hurt finally boiling over. I don't understand what happened, she said when Tommy reluctantly joined her. A week ago, we were actually connecting, sharing real knowledge and experience. You were teaching me things that no textbook could ever capture. Now you're treating me like some kind of threat. Maybe because you are a threat, Tommy said quietly. How? How am I a threat to you? Tommy was quiet for a long moment, his hands clenched at his sides. Because for the first time in 20 years, someone made me think I might actually be worth something. And that's dangerous, Amy, because you're going to leave. And I'm going to be right back where I started. Except now I'll know what I'm missing. Amy felt her heart break a little at the raw honesty in his voice. Tommy, your worth isn't dependent on what I think of you. It exists whether I'm here or not. Easy for you to say, Tommy replied. You have a whole life waiting for you back in Boston. Important work. People who respect you. A future that makes sense. I have a trailer behind my grandmother's house in a community that barely tolerates me. That doesn't have to be your whole story, Amy said desperately. You have knowledge and abilities that are incredibly valuable. You could teach, you could work with other researchers, I could what? Tommy's voice rose slightly. Follow you to Boston and be your exotic Indian boyfriend? Show up at your university parties and tell stories about the reservation? Is that what you think would work? Amy stared at him, suddenly understanding the deeper fears driving his retreat. Is that what you think I want from you? I don't know what you want from me, Tommy said honestly. But I know what I want from you, and that's what scares me. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither of them knew how to cross. Amy took a step toward him, but Tommy backed away. This is exactly what I was afraid of, he said. We're not living in the same world, Amy. You're going to finish your research and go back to your real life. I'm going to stay here and try to forget that for a few weeks someone made me believe I could be more than what I am. What if I didn't want to go back? Amy heard herself say, the words surprising them both. Tommy stared at her. Don't say things like that. Don't make this harder than it already is. As they drove back to her hotel in silence, Amy realized that somehow, without meaning to, she'd fallen in love with this complicated, wounded man who couldn't see his own worth. And he was right. It was going to make everything much harder. The storm came without warning on a Thursday afternoon in late August. Amy was in her hotel room transcribing interview notes when the sky outside her window suddenly turned black. Within minutes, rain was falling in sheets so thick she could barely see the parking lot. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tommy. Flash flood warning. Stay inside until it passes. Amy had heard about desert flash floods but had never experienced one. She watched from her window as water began rushing down the normally dry arroyos, turning them into raging rivers. The power flickered once, twice, then went out completely. 20 minutes later, her phone rang. It was Tommy, his voice tight with urgency. Amy, I need you to get to higher ground. The hotel is too close to the wash, and it's rising fast. I can't even see outside, Amy said, looking out at the wall of water falling from the sky. How am I supposed to get anywhere? I'm coming to get you. Meet me in the lobby in 5 minutes. Tommy, you shouldn't be driving in this. 5 minutes, Amy, don't argue with me. When Amy reached the lobby, she found chaos. Other guests were gathered around the front desk, asking questions the overwhelmed staff couldn't answer. Through the glass doors, Amy could see Tommy's truck pulling up, water already swirling around the tires. Dr. Liu? The desk clerk grabbed her arm. That man is crazy to be driving in this weather. Amy pushed through the doors and ran to Tommy's truck, getting soaked in the few seconds it took to cross the parking lot. Tommy leaned over to open the passenger door, his face grim with concentration. Are you insane? Amy shouted over the sound of the rain on the truck's roof. Probably, Tommy replied, already putting the truck in gear. But that hotel is built right in the floodplain. When this wash really starts moving, it's going to take out everything in its path. As if to prove his point, they passed a car that had been abandoned in the middle of the road, water up to its windows. Tommy navigated around it carefully, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Where are we going? Amy asked. Rosa's house is on higher ground. We'll wait it out there. Tommy glanced at her quickly. Unless you'd rather take your chances at the hotel. I trust you, Amy said without thinking, then realized how true those words were despite everything that had happened between them over the past week. The drive that normally took 15 minutes stretched into an hour as Tommy carefully navigated roads that had become rivers. Amy watched him work, seeing a side of him she'd never witnessed before. He was completely focused, confident in a way that had nothing to do with how others saw him and everything to do with his deep knowledge of the land and weather patterns. There, Tommy pointed to a dark shape moving in the water ahead of them. Someone's car got caught in the current. Amy squinted through the rain and saw a small sedan being pushed sideways by the rushing water, its hazard lights blinking frantically. Through the rear window she could make out 2 figures, an elderly couple trapped inside. Oh my God, Amy breathed. We have to help them. Tommy was already pulling over as close to the stranded car as he could safely get. Stay in the truck, he ordered, grabbing a coil of rope from behind the seat. Tommy, that's too dangerous. That's Henry and Margaret Yazzie, Tommy said, opening his door. They're in their 70s. If I don't get them out of there, they're going to drown. Amy watched in terror as Tommy waded into the rushing water, the rope tied around his waist and secured to his truck's trailer hitch. The current immediately tried to knock him off his feet, but he pressed forward, using his knowledge of the terrain to find the most stable footing. The water was up to his chest by the time he reached the Yazzie's car. Amy could see him talking to them through the window, trying to calm them while he assessed the situation. The car was stuck against a large boulder, but the water level was still rising. Tommy worked quickly, tying the other end of the rope to the car's door handle, then signaling for Amy to back up the truck slowly to create tension in the line. With the rope stabilizing him, he was able to get the car door open and help Henry Yazzie out first. The old man was weak and disoriented, clearly struggling against the current. Tommy had to support almost his full weight as they made their way back to the truck, both of them stumbling several times in the treacherous water. Amy jumped out to help as they reached the truck, grabbing Henry's other arm and helping him into the cab. His wife Margaret was next, and Amy could see the terror in the elderly woman's eyes as Tommy carried her through the rushing water. Are you crazy, boy? Henry gasped once they were all safely in the truck. You could have been killed. You're welcome, Tommy replied dryly. But Amy could see his hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. As they continued toward Rose's house, picking up 2 more stranded families along the way, Amy watched Tommy transform into someone she'd never seen before. Gone was the self-conscious, wounded man who doubted his own worth. In his place was someone who moved with quiet authority, making split-second decisions that saved lives. At Rose's house, which sat safely above the flood zone, they found that word of Tommy's rescues had already spread. People who had barely acknowledged his existence for years were suddenly calling him a hero. "That's 4 families you've saved tonight," Rosa said proudly, as they sat around her kitchen table, drinking hot coffee and waiting for the storm to pass. The Yazzies, the Ramirezes, the Johnsons, and that young couple from Tucson. Tommy shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. Anyone else would have done the same thing. "No," Amy said firmly. Not anyone else would have known where it was safe to cross the water, or how to read the current patterns, or had the courage to go out there in the first place. Henry Yazzie, who had known Tommy since he was a child, reached over and gripped the younger man's shoulder. "Son, I've been wrong about you for a long time. What you did tonight, that took real courage. Your grandfather would have been proud." Amy saw tears gather in Tommy's eyes at the old man's words. For someone who had spent 20 years believing he was a failure, being called courageous by a respected elder was clearly overwhelming. As the night wore on and the storm finally began to subside, Amy found herself sitting on Rosa's front porch with Tommy, both of them wrapped in blankets and watching the last of the lightning flicker across the horizon. "You were incredible tonight," Amy said quietly. "The way you handled everything, the decisions you made, the risks you took to help people, that's who you really are, Tommy. Not the scared, broken person you think you are." Tommy was quiet for a long moment. "I was terrified the whole time," he admitted. "But I kept thinking about what you said about my grandfather, about the night of the fire. Maybe I'm not as useless as I thought." "You're not useless at all," Amy said, and for the first time in weeks Tommy didn't argue with her. "Amy," Tommy said suddenly, his voice uncertain, "what I said before about keeping things professional. I was scared. Not of what people were saying, but of how I felt about you." Amy's heart began to race. "How do you feel about me?" Tommy looked at her then, really looked at her, and Amy saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Hope mixed with determination. "I think I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "And that terrifies me more than any flood ever could." Amy reached for his hand, no longer caring about professional boundaries or community opinions or the complications that lay ahead. "Good," she said, squeezing his fingers, "because I'm already there." As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Amy and Tommy sat together on Rosa's porch, finally honest about the feelings they'd been fighting. The flood had washed away more than just roads and debris. It had swept away the barriers of fear and self-doubt that had been keeping them apart. Tommy had spent the night proving to himself and his community that he was capable of courage, of leadership, of being the man Amy had always seen him to be. And Amy had realized that her feelings for him weren't something to be analyzed or rationalized away. They were real, and they were worth fighting for. The road ahead would still be complicated, but for the first time, they were ready to travel it together. 3 weeks after the flood, Amy sat in her hotel room staring at an email that would change everything. The subject line read, "Research Fellowship Extension, Decision. Required by Friday." Her advisor at Boston University was offering her a prestigious position studying traditional medicine practices across multiple cultures, a dream job that would mean traveling the world, publishing groundbreaking research, and establishing herself as a leading expert in her field. It was everything she'd worked toward for the past 6 years. It was also 3,000 miles away from Tommy. Amy closed her laptop and walked to the window, looking out at the desert landscape that had become so familiar over the past 2 months. Tomorrow marked the official end of her research period on the reservation. She was supposed to pack up her notes, say goodbye to the people who had shared their knowledge with her, and return to Boston to write her dissertation. But the thought of leaving made her feel physically sick. A knock on her door interrupted her brooding. Tommy stood in the hallway holding a small wrapped package, his expression uncertain. "I know you're leaving tomorrow," he said without preamble. "I wanted to give you something before you go." Amy invited him in. noting how he seemed to fill the small hotel room with his presence. Over the past 3 weeks, Tommy had gradually emerged from the shell of self-doubt that had defined him for so long. The community's recognition of his heroism during the flood had given him a confidence that was visible in the way he carried himself, the way he spoke with elders, even the way he looked Amy in the eye. "You didn't have to get me anything," Amy said as she carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was a small piece of traditional beadwork, a bracelet in blues and silvers that caught the light like water. The pattern was intricate, clearly the work of skilled hands. "Rosa made it," Tommy explained, "but I designed the pattern. It's supposed to represent the connection between water and healing, the way traditional knowledge flows from one generation to the next." Amy fastened the bracelet around her wrist, touched by the symbolism. "Tommy, it's beautiful. Thank you." They sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of tomorrow's departure hanging between them like a physical presence. "So," Tommy said finally, "back to Boston in your real life." "Don't call it that," Amy said sharply. "This is real life too. What we've shared here, what I've learned, the connection we've built, that's not just some temporary detour from my real life." "But it is temporary," Tommy pointed out gently. "Your research is finished. You have a dissertation to write, a career to build. You can't put your life on hold because of what happened between us." Amy turned to face him fully. "What if I don't want to go back?" Tommy's expression grew pained. "Amy, we've talked about this. You have opportunities I can't even imagine. You'd be crazy to give that up, would I?" "Tommy, I've spent 6 years studying traditional healing practices around the world, but I've never experienced anything like what I've found here. Not just the knowledge you and Rosa have shared, but the connection to the land, to community, to something bigger than individual achievement." "You can write about all that in your research," Tommy said. "You can share our traditions with the academic world, help people understand the value of indigenous knowledge systems." From a distance, Amy replied, "As an observer, not a participant." They were quiet for a moment, both lost in thoughts about roads taken and not taken. "There's something I need to tell you," Amy said finally. "About the night of the fire, about what really happened?" Tommy tensed. "What do you mean?" Amy took a deep breath. "I talked to Rosa yesterday. Really talked to her about that night when you were 8 years old." "Amy, don't—" "You need to hear this," Amy interrupted. "The apartment building where you lived. It housed 12 families. 36 people, including 8 children under the age of 10. Tommy was staring at her with a mixture of confusion and growing dread. "The fire started in the basement," Amy continued. "Electrical problem that sent smoke up through the building's ventilation system. Most people were asleep when it started. They might not have woken up in time if an 8-year-old boy hadn't run through the hallways screaming for everyone to get out. I was trying to get to Katie," Tommy said weakly. "Yes, and on your way to Katie's room, you woke up the Martinez family, the Johnsons, the elderly couple in 3B. You pounded on doors. You screamed until people woke up and realized they needed to run." Amy's voice was gentle but firm. "Tommy, 34 people survived that fire. 34 people got out alive because a terrified child put aside his own fear long enough to warn them." Tommy's hands were shaking. "But Katie's room was already engulfed when the fire department arrived," Amy said softly. "The investigators determined she probably died from smoke inhalation before you even woke up. There was never any chance of saving her, Tommy. But there was every chance of saving everyone else. And you did that." Tommy put his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with 20 years of suppressed grief and misplaced guilt. "The fire chief at the time wanted to give you a medal for bravery," Amy continued. "Rosa has the newspaper article, but your parents were so destroyed by losing Katie that they couldn't see past their own pain to recognize what you'd done. Why didn't anyone tell me this before?" Tommy's voice was muffled by his hands. "Because everyone assumed you knew. The adults were dealing with their own trauma, their own losses. They thought you understood that you were a hero, not a failure." Amy reached out and gently pulled his hands away from his face. "Rosa said she tried to tell you when you were older, but you'd built such a wall around that night that you couldn't hear anything except your own guilt." Tommy looked at her with eyes that held 20 years of pain and the first glimmers of something that might eventually become peace. 34 people, he repeated, quietly. 34 people who went home to their families because an 8-year-old boy was braver than he knew. They held each other then. Tommy crying for the little boy who had carried an impossible burden for 2 decades. Amy crying for the man who had been robbed of understanding his own heroism. Later, as they sat together watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and purple, Tommy spoke the words that Amy had been both hoping for and dreading. "You should take the fellowship," he said quietly. "This thing between us, it's been good. But you have a whole world waiting for you. I won't be the reason you give up your dreams." "What if my dreams have changed?" Amy asked. "Then make sure you're changing them for the right reasons," Tommy replied. "Not because you feel sorry for some broken-down Apache, but because it's really what you want." "You're not broken down," Amy said fiercely. "You're one of the strongest, most compassionate people I've ever met. You're a healer, Tommy, even if you don't see it yet." "Maybe," Tommy said with a small smile. "But that doesn't change the fact that you have opportunities here that I could never give you." That night, Amy lay awake staring at the ceiling, her laptop open to the fellowship offer email. With a few keystrokes, she could secure her academic future, guarantee herself a prestigious career, return to the world of conferences and publications and grant applications. Or she could choose something else entirely. At 3 a.m, she made her decision. The next day, Amy stood in Rosa's living room with Tommy and his grandmother, her bags packed and loaded in the rental car outside. "I've made a decision about my future," Amy announced, looking at both of them. Tommy's face was carefully neutral, but Amy could see the pain he was trying to hide. "I'm turning down the fellowship in Boston," Amy continued. "Instead, I'm going to apply for a grant to establish a traditional medicine documentation program here on the reservation. A long-term project that would involve working with elders to preserve healing knowledge and training younger tribal members to carry on those traditions." Tommy stared at her. "Amy, you can't." "I can and I am," Amy said firmly. "This isn't about you, Tommy, although what we have together is part of it. This is about finding work that matters, that connects me to something real and meaningful." Rosa began to smile, a wide grin that transformed her entire face. "But what about your career?" Tommy asked. "Your academic future? What about it?" Amy replied. "I'd rather spend my life doing work that makes a difference than climbing some academic ladder that leads nowhere I actually want to go." "Dr. Liu," Rosa said formally, "if you're serious about this, the Tribal Council would need to approve any long-term research partnership." "I understand," Amy said. "I'm hoping you'll both help me write a proposal that respects tribal sovereignty and ensures that any knowledge documented remains under community control." Tommy was still staring at her like she'd announced plans to move to Mars. "Amy, this is crazy. You're giving up everything you've worked for." "No," Amy said, walking over to him and taking his hands. "I'm choosing everything I've actually been working toward. I just didn't realize it until I found it." As Tommy looked down at their joined hands, seeing the bracelet Rosa had made circling Amy's wrist, Amy held her breath and waited for his response. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "Really sure? Because if you stay, if we try to build something together, there's no guarantee it will work out." "There's no guarantee about anything," Amy replied. 1 year later, Amy stood in what used to be an abandoned building on the reservation, now transformed into the traditional Healing Knowledge Center. Sunlight streamed through new windows onto walls decorated with historical photos and traditional artwork. In one corner, Rosa sat with 3 teenage tribal members, teaching them to identify medicinal plants. In another, Tommy worked with a visiting professor from the University of Arizona, discussing the scientific basis of traditional healing practices. The grant proposal had taken months to write and even longer to approve, but the result exceeded everyone's expectations. The center wasn't just documenting traditional knowledge, it was creating a bridge between ancient wisdom and modern medicine, training a new generation of healers who understood both worlds. "Dr. Liu," a young woman named Rebecca approached Amy's desk. "I finished transcribing the interview with Mr. Yazzie about traditional bone-setting techniques. Should I send it to you for review?" "Please," Amy said, smiling at the enthusiasm in Rebecca's voice. "And remember, next week we're filming his demonstration for the video archive." Amy had discovered that her real passion wasn't just studying traditional medicine. It was helping preserve and transmit that knowledge in ways that honored its cultural context while making it accessible to future generations. The center had become a model for other tribes interested in documenting their own healing traditions. "Amy," Tommy called from across the room, "can you come look at this?" She walked over to where he was examining a plant sample under a microscope, his movements confident and precise. The transformation in Tommy over the past year had been remarkable to witness. As his role as a traditional knowledge keeper gained recognition, his self-doubt had gradually given way to quiet pride in his abilities. "What do you see?" Amy asked, looking over his shoulder at the slide. "The compound structures in this desert sage are different from what we documented last month," Tommy explained. "I think seasonal changes affect the concentration of active ingredients." "That's exactly the kind of observation that makes your work so valuable," Amy said. "Traditional healers have always known that timing matters in plant medicine, but now we can document the scientific basis for that knowledge." Tommy looked up at her with the smile that still made her heart skip a beat. "Sometimes I can't believe this is my job now, getting paid to study plants and share stories with researchers from around the world." "Believe it," Amy said, touching the traditional wedding band he now wore. "You've earned this respect." Their wedding 6 months earlier had been a celebration that blended traditions in ways that honored both their backgrounds. Rosa had conducted the Apache ceremony at sunrise, while Amy's parents had flown in from California to share elements of Chinese wedding customs. The tribal council had given their blessing, and even the community members who had once disapproved of their relationship had come to see Amy as someone who brought value rather than taking it away. "Amy, Tommy," Rosa called from her teaching corner, "come see what these young ones have learned." They walked over to where the teenagers were carefully sorting dried plants into categories. Amy marveled at how quickly they were absorbing knowledge that had taken her months to understand. Under Rosa's patient guidance, they were learning not just which plants to use for specific ailments, but the spiritual protocols that made traditional healing more than just herbal medicine. "This is how knowledge stays alive," Rosa said with satisfaction, "not in books that sit on shelves, but in young hands that can carry it forward." "Speaking of carrying things forward," Tommy said, giving Amy a meaningful look, "we have some news to share." Amy felt her cheeks warm as she realized what Tommy was about to announce. They had planned to wait another month before telling anyone, but Rosa's comment about the future seemed like the perfect opening. "We're going to have a baby," Amy said, watching Rosa's face light up with joy. "A baby," Rosa exclaimed, immediately rising to embrace both of them. "When?" "Early spring," Tommy said, his voice full of wonder and pride. "We found out yesterday." The teenagers gathered around, offering congratulations and asking questions about whether the baby would learn traditional healing practices. Amy laughed at their enthusiasm, touched by how quickly they had accepted her as part of their community. As the afternoon wound down and people began heading home, Amy and Tommy walked hand in hand to their house, a small place they had built together on land the tribal council had granted them. It wasn't fancy, but it had everything they needed. A garden where Amy grew the herbs she studied, a workshop where Tommy could prepare traditional medicines, and windows that looked out over the desert landscape they both loved. "Are you scared?" Tommy asked as they sat on their front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "About the baby?" "A little," Amy admitted. "But mostly I'm excited. This child will grow up understanding both worlds, traditional knowledge and modern science, Apache culture and Chinese heritage. They'll have choices we never had." "I keep thinking about my grandfather," Tommy said quietly, "how he used to say that everything in life happens for a reason. Even the painful things. If there hadn't been a fire, if I hadn't carried all that guilt, if I hadn't believed I was worthless for so long, you might never have spent all those hours with the elders, learning the traditional ways," Amy finished. "You might never have developed the deep connection to healing, knowledge that makes you such an effective teacher. Now, and you might never have chosen to stay if I hadn't needed someone to show me my own worth," Tommy added. They sat in comfortable silence, both reflecting on the unlikely path that had brought them together. Amy thought about the career she had given up, the academic life that had once seemed so important. She felt no regret about her choice, only gratitude for finding work that fed her soul instead of just her resume. "I have something for you," Tommy said suddenly, reaching into his pocket. "A gift for the baby." He handed Amy a small piece of traditional beadwork, a tiny pair of moccasins decorated with symbols that told a story of protection and blessing. "Rosa helped me make them," Tommy admitted. "She said every Apache child should have moccasins made by their father's hands, even if those hands are still learning the traditional ways." Amy cradled the tiny shoes in her palms, overwhelmed by the love and hope they represented. "They're perfect," she whispered. "I want our child to grow up knowing they're worthy of love just as they are," Tommy said. "I want them to understand that scars don't define you, that healing is possible, that being different can be a gift instead of a burden." "They will," Amy promised. "We'll make sure of that." As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, Amy reflected on how much her life had changed since she first arrived on the reservation. She had come seeking traditional healing knowledge and found instead a partner, a community, and a sense of purpose she had never imagined possible. Tommy had also been transformed, evolving from a man who believed he was unworthy of love into someone who understood his own value and could help others recognize theirs. The work they did together at the center was healing not just individuals, but the broader relationship between traditional and modern approaches to wellness. "What are you thinking about?" Tommy asked, noticing Amy's contemplative mood. "Just this," Amy said, gesturing to encompass their house, the reservation, the life they had built together. "A year ago, I thought success meant publishing papers and getting tenure at a prestigious university. Now I know it means doing work that matters with people you love." "No regrets?" Tommy asked. "None," Amy replied without hesitation. "This is exactly where I'm supposed to be." As they prepared for bed that night, Amy looked at her reflection in their bedroom mirror. The woman staring back at her was tanned from desert sun, her hands rough from garden work, her hair longer and looser than she had worn it during her academic years. She looked different than she had a year ago, more grounded, more content, more herself. Tommy appeared behind her in the mirror, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "I love you," he said simply, words that had taken him months to believe he had the right to say. "I love you too," Amy replied, leaning back against his solid warmth, looking at their reflection. Tommy's scars no longer hidden but simply part of his face, Amy's wedding ring catching the lamplight, both of them glowing with happiness and anticipation for the future. Amy understood that sometimes the most important journeys led not to distant destinations, but home to places and people you never expected to find. Their story wasn't ending with marriage and pregnancy. It was just beginning. There would be challenges ahead, raising a child between two cultures, expanding the Healing Center's programs, continuing to bridge the gap between traditional and modern medicine. But they would face those challenges together, drawing strength from their love and from the community that had embraced them both. Tommy had learned that being worthy of love wasn't something he had to earn through heroic acts or perfect behavior. It was something that existed simply because he existed, scars and all. Amy had discovered that home wasn't a place you returned to, but something you built with people who saw your true value. And Rosa, watching her grandson prepare for fatherhood with joy instead of fear,